Hello, friends. My name is Gabriel Said Reynolds. I teach theology and Islamic studies at the University of Notre Dame in the Department of Theology. I'm here on campus recording a video for exploring the Qur'an and the Bible on the Qur'an's engagement with Christianity. The theme of this talk is not simply the way the Qur'an engages with Jesus or Christian figures or Christian teachings, but rather how Christianity in the historical context of the Qur'an becomes a conversation partner for the Qur'an. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we're going to get going. Okay, so here you see the title, The Qur'an's Theological Engagement with Christianity, and I'll be addressing this topic in 4 main units. First, we'll speak about traditional ideas about Christianity and Islam's emergence, and then we'll speak about Christianity in the Qur'an, Christianity in late antique Arabia, so historical analysis, and then finally a sort of conclusion, a larger analysis and consideration of the Quran's theology and Christianity generally. Let's start with traditional ideas. There's a quotation there you can read from the Scottish scholar Richard Bell, who basically summarizes what was the common early scholarly approach to this question of Islam's emergence and Christianity, namely that Christians were around in Arabia, but they were sort of here or there, scattered, that Christianity generally had not made a profound impression on the Arabic-speaking inhabitants of the Arabian Peninsula. He says, you can see how he notes there that Christianity had not produced a religious literature in the Arabic language. Of course, we have no written literature in Arabic before the Quran. And then he concludes by saying, but it was left to Islam to bring that impulse. I'm going to challenge his argument in the course of this lecture. Okay, but let's sort of start at the beginning by looking at how the Islamic sources present Christians in the context of Islam's emergence and the first proclamation of the Quran. The first Christian, as the Quran is revealed to Muhammad, whom we meet, is, of course, the cousin of Muhammad's first wife, Khadija. His name is Waraka. Here's a quotation on the left-hand side of the screen from the classic biographer of the Prophet named Ibn Ishaq. This is a translation of Guillaume, who tells, that is, Ibn Ishaq tells the story of how the Prophet, after receiving his first revelation, came down the mountain and was comforted by his wife at first, but then his wife reached out to her cousin, Waraka, and we read, then she rose and gathered her garments about her and set forth to her cousin Waraka, who had become a Christian and read the scriptures and learned from those who followed the Torah and the gospel. And when she related to him what the apostle of God told her he had seen and heard, Waraka cried, holy, holy, verily by him in whose hand is Waraka's soul. If thou hast spoken to me the truth, O Khadija, there hath come unto him the greatest namus, that's clearly related to the Greek word nomos, meaning law, who came to Moses aforetime, and lo, he is a prophet of this people. Okay, and so one gets the notion from reports such as this that Christians were here and there. For example, Waraka was a Christian in Mecca, so there was at least one Christian in Mecca. We also know the story of Muhammad as a child traveling with his uncle Abu Talib to Syria and meeting a Christian there named Bahira. And I think early Western scholars of Islam's history were sort of influenced by these reports and what they knew, or they thought they knew, of Christianity in the 6th and early 7th century in Arabia. And so, for example, Richard Bell has this idea that, well, Christians might have sort of passed through. There weren't sort of settled communities of Christians. Christianity was not a robust presence in the Arabian Peninsula. So he writes, for example, no doubt too, as at the present day, camel riders and caravans, including Christian camel riders, continually visited centers of population. Bell, here's a longer excerpt from Bell. This, by the way, is his book of the origin of Islam and its Christian environment. He goes ahead and says, that Muhammad himself knew of the existence of the scriptures of the Bible, the Old and New Testaments, and he wanted to know more about them. The rest of his career in Mecca is characterized by his efforts to acquire knowledge of the concept of scripture and the molding influence which that knowledge had upon him. So it was something that was not sort of a steady and important presence in the Quran's context. That is, the Bible was not this important presence, but rather Muhammad himself sought out, by meeting certain Christian characters, knowledge of the Bible. Meanwhile, Arabia generally was experiencing what Bell calls dramatically the creeping in of a dim, unmoralized idea of a superior deity. So there was a general sort of monotheism sort of floating around, as Richard Bell would put it. Gerald Hawting, in his excellent book, The Idea of Idolatry, speaks of the common traditional notion. It's not his, I don't think, but he's summarizing earlier scholarship, that the Arabs were sort of on an evolutionary path, and through natural means, they were moving from polytheism to monotheism. And so we have Quranic passages, for example, in the Quran, Al-Ankabut in 29, if thou askest them, that is the mushrikun or the pagans, who created the heavens and the earth and subjected the sun and the moon, they will say, God. How then are they perverted? Okay, another common notion of earlier Western scholars about Christianity in Arabia at the dawn of Islam is that, well, whatever Christianity must have been there would not have been sort of orthodox standard Christianity, but would have been in one way or another heretical, or as one scholar puts it, debased. This is a writing of a Christian missionary named Speer. I think he was an American, from the record of a missionary conference at Lucknow, India in 1911. Speer writes that the view of Christianity which lies at the base of Islam and which led Muhammad to repudiate it was a false view. He had never met the Christianity of Christ and the apostles. The Quran shows what a travesty of the gospel had come to him. When we inquire into Muhammad's rejection of Christianity, we find that he never had anything but the most perverted idea of what Christianity really was. The Christianity which he rejected was a very debased type, half polytheistic in its theology, superstitious, etc., etc. Okay, so this is sort of a Protestant take on the question of Christianity in the Arabian Peninsula. Some scholars, especially Protestant scholars, have this idea that like Christianity generally was debased from its pure form in the apostolic age of the apostles, and it wasn't until Martin Luther that things were set straight again. But then, especially in Arabia, the idea is that there would have been heresies out there, sort of beyond the bounds of the Byzantine Empire, where the emperor and others could have controlled the religious context. And so poor Muhammad, I mean, the way they see it, poor Muhammad, he never met true Christians. He only met these debased or heretical Christians. This is even Hamilton Gibb in his work, Pre-Islamic Monotheism in Arabia, writes that such communities certainly existed in Arabia, but there's considerable evidence both from Muslim texts and from external sources that other monotheistic groups were to be found in Arabia independently of the organized churches, and hence heretical in their eyes. There's an old saying that Arabia was the womb or the bearer of heresies. Gibb seems to be channeling that in this quotation, that in Arabia there were only heretical Christians. In a remarkable work of scholarship published in the past few years by the brilliant scholar Aziz al-Azmeh, entitled The Emergence of Islam, I think in Late Antiquity is the full title. He actually sort of doubles down on this idea. And maybe pushing back against some more recent scholarship that argues for a more important presence of Judaism and Christianity in Arabia. Al-Azmeh says that actually no, he doesn't credit this thought to earlier Western scholars, but he seems to double down on what they say by arguing that Western Arabia, that is the Hijaz, that is the region of Mecca and Medina, where Islam emerges, was basically pagan. He uses this phrase, it was a pagan reservation. Western Arabia of around 600 AD or CE was an anachronism in terms of religious history. It was not contemporary with surrounding territories between which it was wedged. It was a pagan reservation that had been largely passed over by developments occurring elsewhere. It was in a real sense historically retarded with respect to surrounding areas. So he sort of doubles down on that idea. And he, of course, recognizes that there's a lot of biblical material in the Quran, but he writes, the Quranic biblicism did not amount to a biblicization or biblization of the Quran, but it rather involved a Quranization of biblical figures, fragments, and templates. So there were just sort of fragments, images, shadows of biblical ideas that the Quran took and reshaped or reformed according to its own template to make these traditions and characters Quranic. Okay, so we're going to begin to evaluate some of these claims. We'll be looking now at Christianity in the Quran. How does the Quran speak of Christianity? This is a nice image I want to introduce briefly. This is a work by a fellow, an American artist by the name of Sandow Birk, entitled The American Qur'an, where he tries to juxtapose, he doesn't try, he does, juxtapose images from American life with elements of the Qur'an. He also hand wrote out a translation of the Qur'an, which he puts together with these images. So here, Al-Kahf, Surah 18, is presented alongside an image of, for those who may know, the Appalachian region, West Virginia, where there's coal mining, and here we see the coal miners being trapped, but actually they are presented as though they were the sleepers in the cave, even with a dog. So interesting work of art, Sandow Birk. Okay, so how do we have a sense of the way that the Quran itself engages with Christianity? I mean, one way is to notice how frequently it employs biblical and especially New Testament turns of phrase. So here's one example from Quran 7. As for those who deny signs, the gates of heaven will not be opened for them, nor shall they enter paradise until the camel passes through the needle's eye. Hatta yalija al-jamalu fi as-sammi khiyat. And thus do we requite the guilty. Okay, many of you may know that the notion of the impossibility of something happening and expressing that before or by reference to the dramatic image of a camel passing through the eye of the needle is known from the New Testament. So there's a quotation there. Now, interestingly, the New Testament phrase is in the context of a discussion about a rich man, how hard it is for a rich man to enter heaven. So the Quran uses the turn of phrase about a camel in the eye of the needle, but not for a rich man, rather for someone who denies God's signs, which suggests that the Quran is not simply copying biblical material, but is using a well-known phrase or figure of speech to articulate its own teaching. We're going to return to that point. A couple other examples, the Quran in two places, I think, one of which is 288, refers or has the Israelites or Jews say about themselves, our hearts are covered, but the way it has them say our hearts are covered is literally, our hearts are uncircumcised. Qulubuna ghulf. There's a variant to that, which is ghuluf, which I won't speak about now. So isn't that interesting? Because this is a very important turn of phrase that is meant to, that is the notion of the circumcision of the heart or uncircumcision of the heart, that is meant to contrast the spiritual circumcision with fleshly circumcision. I've given an example here of the Acts of the Apostles where that is used, Acts chapter 7, verses 51 to 53. This is Stephen's speech before the Sanhedrin, where that phrase comes up there, you stubborn people with uncircumcised hearts and ears. And that's this phrase or turn of phrase is found also in the Old Testament, where the Israelite prophets use it for their own people. So it's both an Old Testament and New Testament phrase. Once again, the Quran uses it in a different way. It's not really interested in the question of a spiritual circumcision, as like the author of Acts is, but rather it simply uses it to say our hearts are closed or covered or refuse to listen. So once again, we see that a biblical turn of phrase is used, probably because it was well known in the Quran's historical context, but to a new effect. So here's some more biblical turns of phrase, and we'll see most of them, not all, are from the New Testament. The use of the mustard seed, twinkling of the eye, and then this interesting bit, Quran chapter 9, verse 80, where God tells the prophet, whether you plead forgiveness for them, that is the mushrikun or the unbelievers or the associators, 70 times, God will never forgive them. Well, isn't that interesting? Of all the numbers to choose, why 70? Well, it's intriguing that in the Gospel of Matthew and I think other synoptic Gospels, but I'm not sure. The question of forgiveness comes up. How often should I forgive? And Jesus says 70 times. 7. So that's interesting. Another one is Quran 21 speaks of on the day of judgment, the heaven being rolled back like a scroll, which sort of makes sense if you remember that heaven is sort of pictured as a firmament in the Quran, a sort of dome, which blocks the divine realm above and the earthly realm below. And so that could be sort of rolled up, that dome. But that's a biblical image. It's found here in Isaiah and again in the New Testament in the book of Revelation. Another interesting one, and this is clearly connected to Judaism, not Christianity, so this is the exception. That proves the rule. is this amazing play on Hebrew, where the Israelites are made to say in the Qur'an, they're presented as sort of rebellious, sort of ostentatiously rebellious and obstinate, in that God says to them, basically obey, and they say, we hear and disobey. In the Arabic is sami'na wa asayna, which is really intriguing, because in the Pentateuch, we find on 2 occasions, the Israelites say precisely the opposite: we shall listen and put into practice, or we shall listen and do, literally. And so the Quran is like flipping this around to make them look, in this case, rebellious. Because the Hebrew is washamana, which is cognate with sami'na, wa asinu, which is not cognate with asena, but sounds like asena. And asena has the opposite meaning of asinu, put into practice or do. Hope that makes sense. So there's an awareness there, not only with a Jewish or biblical turn of phrase, but specifically with the Hebrew behind it. So super, super interesting. Okay, here's another one. Back to the New Testament, no soul knows what comfort is laid up for them secretly as a recompense for what they were doing. Compare that to 1 Corinthians, a famous phrase, 2:9, as it is written, what no eye seen, no ear heard, nor the heart of man conceive, what God has prepared for those who love him. So one more bit. So 2 important things about these turns of phrase. One is that they tend to be, not universally, but they tend to be Christian and not Jewish. And 2, that they're used for a new theological point. Both of those suggest that these are turns of phrase that were commonly known in the air in the Quran's context, which points to or redounds to a biblical culture, not just individuals like, I don't know, Waraka who are hanging out, or maybe some group from Najran who came and visited one day the Prophet in Medina, but rather Christian culture where these turns of phrase were in the air, were being used, and used not just to quote the Bible, but used in other contexts as well. Hope that makes sense. Okay, so on to the second half of the talk. I'm just going to give some examples of how the Quran uses Jesus to articulate its own theology and prophetology. Here in Quran chapter 5, Al-Ma'idah, verse 117, God has a conversation with Jesus. It starts in the verse before, and Jesus says to God, I only said to them what thou didst command me, serve God, my Lord and your Lord, and I was a witness over them while I remained among them, etc., etc. So here, of all the figures who could be used to articulate the Quran theology, the Quran chooses Jesus, serve God, my Lord and your Lord. So pretty interesting that Jesus is not simply cited, I don't know, for the biblical stories about him, but is actually employed as a sort of spokesman in the Quran for Quranic theology. And then in this example, Quran 61, Asaf 61:6, the Quran employs Jesus to make a point about its prophetology, namely that there is a prophet coming after him. And when Jesus and Mary said, children of Israel, I'm indeed the messenger of God to you, confirming the Torah that is before me, and giving good tidings of a messenger after me, or who shall come after me, whose name shall be Ahmed. So hopefully that's clear. The Quran, in my mind, thoughtfully employs Jesus to articulate its own theology and its own prophetology. Okay, so I think that's a pretty important point. We're going to return to this latter phrase because the way it speaks of good tidings, I think, is interesting. Of course, Quran 61:6 has been commented on because people imagine that it could have a connection with the New Testament proclamations in which Jesus promises the coming of the Holy Spirit as the Paraclete or the Advocate. And there's been some really good things written about how Quran 61:6 could be in touch with that. It is commented famously upon by Ibn Ishaq, who tries to connect the Paraclete passage with the prediction of Muhammad in Quran 61:6. Okay, I mean, Christianity is found in the Quran really dramatically in stories, which do not only come from the New Testament, but come from stories that were circulating widely among Christians. The story of the angels bowing down before Adam is really important in late antiquity, famously in the Cave of Treasures. That has maybe the closest connection to the Quran. But I wanted to quote this text from the life of Adam and Eve. And Life, Adam and Eve is a text which may have Jewish origins, but was basically circulating among Christians in Christian languages, a whole bunch of different Christian languages in late antiquity. I mean, the key point here is that for the Quran, the story of the refusal of Iblis, or the devil, to bow before Adam along with the other angels leads to the story of Iblis being sent out from paradise and cursed, rajim, cursed or expelled by God. And that explains why the devil seeks to lead man astray. Thereafter, it's a sort of revenge, right? I believe the devil even says in the Quran to God, because you led me astray, I will lead him astray. I will lead man astray, or humanity astray. Okay, this notion of the devil out for revenge and the devil blaming humanity for his fall is really prominent in Life, Adam and Eve. You can read the quotation there. All my arrogance, he's speaking to Adam, all my arrogance and sorrow came to pass because of you. For because of you, I went forth from my dwelling. Because of you, I was alienated from the throne of the cherubs, etc., etc. Okay, many other passages of the Quran, even those that involve Old Testament stories or figures, seem to have Christian context. For example, in the story of Joseph in Quran 12, the Quran the Quran speaks of a wolf that had killed Joseph, of course not actually killed, but according to the brother's story, whereas Genesis has a wild animal. Why does the Quran go from wild animal to wolf? Well, in Christian tellings of the Genesis tale, Joseph is clearly identified as a wolf. Sorry, Joseph is clearly, it's a big distinction. Joseph clearly identified as a sheep and the brothers as wolves, because Joseph is presented according to a typology that links him with Jesus. In Jesus in the New Testament is presented as a sheep or lamb of God. And so this is very important in Christian retellings of the Joseph story, where the brothers become wolves and Joseph becomes a sheep. In Jewish tellings, this is not the case. In the Jewish stories, which elaborate, like Midrashic Jewish stories, which elaborate on the Genesis story, Joseph is not made out to be a wolf. This has been studied really with great precision by Joseph Whitstone in his dissertation, The Syriac Milieu of the Quran. There are other examples. I mean, a famous one is that the Quran speaks of both the story of the sleepers of Ephesus and the story of Alexander in Quran 18, or Surah Al-Kahf. Interestingly, for the sleepers of Ephesus, it debates how many sleepers there were, and there was an actual debate in late antiquity, or a difference between certain traditions which made them 7 and certain traditions which made them 8 among Christians. So it was a debate, and the Quran seems to intervene on this debate by, it eventually says, like, you don't have to debate this, you don't have to speak about it, but it intervenes and it gives different options about how many sleepers there were. And then the Alexander or the Qur'an story, I won't get into it in depth. Tommaso Tazzei has worked on this, but the Quran is engaging robustly with the Syriac traditions of Alexander in the way it tells the Qur'an story. Okay, so I'm not going to speak too much about this. Jacob of Sarug dies in the early 6th century, a Syriac figure, Syriac Christian father. But that's a little excerpt from his telling of the Sleepers of Ephesus story, where again he employs the metaphor of wolf and sheep. So it's just another example of how it was important for Christians. Okay, let's get on to Christianity in late antique Arabia. Here's a quotation from Surah An-Nahl, Surah 16, in which the unbelievers are made to say that Muhammad has an informant. And the Quran responds, well, this informant speaks a foreign language, a barbarous language. Ajami is the Arabic word, whereas this, or his teachings, that is this revelation, is in Arabic. Okay, isn't that intriguing? Who was this figure? Surah An-Nahl by tradition is Meccan, but anyway, Meccan or wherever. Who is this figure in the Hijaz, who is not speaking Arabic, and who apparently is around, is enough of a familiar figure that someone actually points to him and says, this is the mortal who is teaching Muhammad. Well, I mean, this reflects bilingualism. The Quran itself then points to bilingual context, where there's someone speaking an Ajami language. In my opinion, that's my reading of Ajami there. That's something that could be debated. But just to sort of confirm that there's bi and multilingualism in the Quran, we have just a wide range of vocabulary, which has ultimately non-Arabic origin in the Quran. Of course, some of these words could have entered generations before into Arabic and have become Arabized by the time the Quran was preached. But Iblis comes from Greek diabolos, Shaitan from Hebrew Satan, Torah from Hebrew Torah, Injil from Greek Evangelion for gospel, Nasara is connected to Greek that gives us Nazareans. Ma'idah seems to come from Ethiopic Ma'ed, Hawariyun from Ethiopic Hawaria. I don't speak Ethiopic. I tried to learn how to read Ge'ez with a good teacher once, but I'm not very good at it. So that's my story. Yeah, I mean, just other phrases there. I won't go through them all. And then we have a sense, not outside of the Quran, that there was bilingualism in the Quran, because thanks to the work of people like Ahmad Jalad, who wrote this article on the linguistic landscape of pre-Islamic Arabia, we just have many examples of inscriptions that have Aramaic and Arabic words, which makes us think, even in the context of the Surah An-Nahl verse, that the bilingualism was Aramaic and Arabic. So here's a quotation. It's pretty early, an inscription rather from the 3rd century, but has the definite article, the demonstrative article there in Aramaic, but the rest in Arabic until you get to bar, the word for sun. In Aramaic, the numbers is in Aramaic, the month and the word for month is not shahr, but is yarha or something like that in Aramaic. So mar instead of rab, you have mar, meaning Lord. So just integrated together, I mean, people were able to do inscriptions where Aramaic and Arabic were brought together. And then we have signs in other inscriptions a little bit later, usually from the 5th and 6th century. These are the so-called Paleo-Arabic inscriptions that Ahmad Jalad, including on this channel on 2 occasions, has discussed. Although this quotation was studied by Leila Name, the French scholar. And here you can see, you can probably make out some of the words like El-Ilah there. And the inscription is translated there. It's coming from the 6th century, middle of the 6th century, from Jof or Duma, north of Medina, really in the southernmost edge, I believe, of the Nabatean realm. But intriguingly, you have a cross here, which indicates that it's not just anyone there who has the faith in El-Ilah, the God, but it's a Christian. So there in the heart of the Arabian Peninsula, you have a Christian inscription from the mid-6th century. So that's interesting. I also wanted to speak about another inscription which has biblical flavor to it. This is the so-called pre-Islamic Basmala inscription, not from the north now in the Paleo-Arabic script, but from the south in a script that's used for ancient South Arabian. I believe this is actually written in the minuscule script, even though it's sort of a monumental inscription, which is unusual for those who know the scripts of ancient South Arabian. But again, studied by Ahmad Jalad, although it's the original Arabic inscription that I wanted to give reference to here. But this is the rendering of Ahmad Jalad, just to give him full credit, from his article, The Pre-Islamic Basmala. And he doesn't really see it as a Basmala. He sees the first Rahman there indeed as a second name for God after Allah, Allah the Rahman. And he sees the second Rahman there as an imperative with a pronominal object suffix, have mercy upon us. And he argues, I mean, it's a great article, you should read it. I believe it's available on the internet. He argues that the point of the inscription was to bring together the North Arabian name used for God, Allah, and the South Arabian name used for God, Ar-Rahman, which the Quran itself does call on him as Allah or call on him as Ar-Rahman. So, yeah, and then he just shows, you can read in the rest of the screen, that some of this language in this inscription seems to be connected to Psalm 90, both in satisfy us in the morning with your benevolence, and then grant us the essence of it to number our days. Again, is Psalm 90, teach us to number our days. I mean, that's really intriguing. There seems The fact that there's two correspondences with the same psalm is very intriguing. Okay, so I mean, going back to the north of Arabia, which brings us closer to the Hijaz, it's just, and Ahmad Jalad has spoken about this on this channel, exploring the Quran and the Bible, there's a revolution before the revolution. So if Islam is a revolution, there's a revolution before the revolution of Islam, which is the unification of all of the various scripts that takes place by the 6th century into the Paleo-Arabic script, the sort of the proto or pre-Arabic script that ultimately is used in a modified form for the Quran, and then the appearance of these Paleo-Arabic inscriptions, and the monotheistic nature of these inscriptions. So something happened, friends, in the late 6th, early 7th, the late 5th, early 6th century, before the revolution of Islam in the 7th century. Okay, so this is what Hoyland says, this is an idea whose time had come. And then here's two quotations from Jalad, just showing that in the south, the polytheistic inscriptions disappear pretty early by the 4th century. But in the 6th century, so 100 years before Islam, the polytheist inscriptions disappear in North Arabia. So there's a revolution before the revolution. That's just super important in thinking about the origins of the Quran. There's lots of inscriptions, some of which are in Syria, Jebel Sais and Haran. I think Jebel Sais may be in Jordan. Actually, Haran is also in Syria and includes Syriac. There's there's North Arabian Paleo-Arabic inscriptions that have been found in Najran, not ancient South Arabian. And very close from Mecca, Ahmad Jalad and Haytham Sidki have studied the inscription known as Rih, or in a place known as Rih Zalala, that uses really intriguing language like the root for blessing, ba, ra, kaf, and the use or the reference to God as our Lord, Rabbana. Okay, and the Quran itself suggests not only was it Christian languages in terms of phrase and characters and stories, but there were Christians around. I mean, most dramatically in Quran 2240, this is an image on the right of an excavation, I think in the eastern part of the Arabian Peninsula, of an old monastic complex. But the Quran itself speaks of monasteries, and it does so, intriguingly, in a positive way. Had God not driven back the people, some by the means of others, there had been destroyed cloisters, sawame, or monastic or hermit cells, could be cloisters. I believe it's from an Ethiopic word, sawame, and churches, bia, oratories, sometimes translated as synagogues, salawat, and mosques, wherein God's name is much mentioned. So the Quran itself speaks in a positive way of cloisters, churches, oratories, or synagogues, in addition to mosques. So again, this does not bespeak a few Christians wandering around. It bespeaks settled Christian communities. Okay, so just final bit here, and then we'll wrap it up. The Quran's theology in Christianity. I just wanted to note that the Quran, even in its use of language, seems to be engaging with language that Christians would find familiar. So when it speaks of Jesus predicting the coming of Ahmed or Muhammad, Jesus says, Mubashir, I am Mubashir, I'm bringing a bushra, good tidings of a messenger come after me. And this is, of course, what the apostles of the New Testament do when they preach the gospel meaning good news. They're preaching good news or good tidings. The Quran, of course, refers to itself as a bushra in Quran chapter 2, verse 97, over here on the right side. Sorry, I'll go back. Over here on the right side of the screen. So that's important. This is cognate with the word used in Christian Palestinian Aramaic, or the root for the gospel. Syriac has it flipped around there with the sin coming before the ba, but still cognate, same root, just with the flipping of two consonants there. So that's intriguing. Also intriguing, this may be a little more controversial. Not sure if many people agree with me, but nevertheless, this is YouTube after all. There's this old idea among Christian Arabs that the Basmala, or the invocation of God as a merciful, the compassionate, here it has the benefactor, the merciful, alludes to the Trinity. Now, this is not my argument. I'm not arguing for a Christianizing reading of the Quran, but that the Quran speaks of God in this tripartite or threefold invocation is interesting. Why a threefold invocation? Why speak of God as Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, in the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate? I'm not arguing that that is a Trinitarian invocation, but that it's three could be modeled on Christian, especially in baptismal context, Trinitarian invocations. This is not a new idea. Angelika Neuwirth has discussed this. Manfred Kropp has also discussed this. Also, in Surah Al-Fatiha, the first surah of the Quran, is the concluding two verses, guide us in the straight path. The path of those thou hast blessed, not the path of those against whom thou art wrathful, nor of those who are astray. So the Quran speaks of three groups: the ones who are blessed, the ones against whom you are angry, that is God, and the ones who are astray. There's an old idea in the commentaries, Ibn Jawzi and many other commentators say this, that the ones with whom God is angry are the Jews, and the ones who went astray are the Christians. And this is brought forth in the translation of Muhsin Khan. That's two different figures, one, I believe, a Moroccan, and Khan, an Afghani, who say such as the Jews, such as a Christian. There, I mean, again, Paul of Antioch, this Christian figure from the 13th century, has a Christianizing reading. He says, wait, there are actually three groups that the Quran is referring to as though they were all others. First, the blessed, and then those against whom God is angry, and then the astray. And so he says, oh, the blessed must be the Christians, and the Quran has the believer ask God to make them like the blessed, that is the Christians. And then the wrathful are the Jews, and those astray are the mushrikun, or the associators. Okay, it's maybe not important right now, but I think there's some coherence in the old Islamic exegetical idea that the Jews are those against whom God is wrathful, and the Christians are those who, of course, in the Quran's opinion, are astray. Wrath is frequently associated with divine wrath is frequently associated with the Jews in the Quran, and I would argue the Quran basically sees the Christians as astray. So maybe even in its opening surah, the Quran models its invocation on Trinitarian invocations and refers to Christians at the very end. So both the beginning and the end of the Fatiha, there are references to Christians. Okay, I almost finished here, but just want to point out that there are other places where you may not find Christianity referred to explicitly, but it might be there. So the famous light verse of the Quran has this image of a lamp and a blessed tree, an olive tree in particular. People have commented that this could be language that's biblical. Some of the Old Testament prophets have images of basically beatific vision or visions of God that use the language of light in a way that is intriguingly close to Quran 24:35. But there seems to be an allusion in the verses that follow that the light in the lamp and the niche, the prayer niche, is found in temples. It just says houses. I mean, this is Arbery's translation. He dramatically says temples. Biyut is the Arabic word. God has allowed to be raised up and his name to be commemorated therein. And in these houses are men who neither commerce, or whom neither commerce, nor trafficking diverts from the remembrance of God to perform the prayer, pray the alms, fearing a day when hearts. So what are these places where the men are neither working nor trading, but they're just praying all the time? Are these not monks in monasteries? Okay, the larger point, friends, is we've built an argument for a number of indicators that point to the Quran in engaging with a robustly Christian culture, marked by Christian language in the turns of phrase in the air, marked by the presence of settled Christian communities, churches, and monasteries. And this might help us think through the way the Quran is articulating its own arguments. Angelika Neuwirth likes to speak about the speaker-hearer interaction. Just to give an analogous case in studies of the New Testament, here's an excerpt from a scholar of the Gospel of John, who says the Hellenistic features of the fourth Gospel tell us more about its final audience than about the background of its author or its tradition. So we can see how in the biblical scholarship, there's an interest in understanding the Hellenistic context, at least for the fourth gospel or John, as a way of better understanding that gospel. So too for the Qur'an. The Christian culture of Arabia in the 6th and early 7th centuries, at the dawn of Islam, should be a key for us in unlocking, at least in part, the meaning of the Quran. Okay, thank you for hanging in there. If you've watched this far, thank you for being with me. There's a shot of some of the books above my desk here at the University of Notre Dame. And I'm really grateful that you're here at Exploring the Quran and the Bible. Please take a moment, friends, to like this video and to subscribe to the channel and to tell everyone about it.